Well, it looks like we are recording, so let's go ahead and set the camera here. There we go. Set the camera. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Montana Technological University Constitution Day lecture. My name's Dr. John Garrick. I'll be your lecturer tonight. I want to start off first by thanking our Chancellor, Dr. Les Cook, our Provost, Dr. Steve Gammons, and our Dean of Students, Dr. Carrie Bath, for selecting me to give this lecture tonight. I see that we have student representation here tonight, faculty representation, and representatives from the community. Thank you for being here. Today is Constitution Day. It marks the 233rd anniversary of the drafting and signing of our U.S. Constitution on this date in 1787. So let me get started with our presentation. All right, there we are. The title of my presentation tonight, the 1787 Constitutional Approval of Slavery and its Ongoing Legacy through to today's Black Lives Matter era. For those of you who don't know about me, I teach in the Department of Business, and my educational background, I have a bachelor's degree in psychology, master's degree in counseling, and my Juris Doctorate in law. I did practice law and served as a judge, and then got into academics. I am a member of the U.S. Supreme Court Bar since 1985. So that's enough about me. I teach legal related things. So let's get started. So here is a picture of the Hancock County Courthouse in Bay St. Louis, Mississippi. I want to start with this because I'm going to tell you tonight about the time that I got arrested. I know you are shocked, oh my gosh, Dr. Garrick was arrested, what for? Oh my. Well, I'll tell you about that, but I'm starting with this sort of to whet your appetite for the entire presentation, because I'll tell you the whole story later. And it is tangentially related to our topic tonight. But this event, this arrest, started my lifelong interest in the law, and as scary as this event was, it has motivated me to a wonderful career. Thinking back to that arrest and my younger life, I certainly can remember seeing some whites only, colored only drinking fountains, and of course the movie cinema. The orchestra lower level was for whites, and the balcony was for blacks, and separate concession stands. And so all of these experiences have caused me to connect the dots. But holy cow, why? Why did this happen? So here's my thesis. My thesis is that slavery and the continuing legacy of slavery have impacted our country in deep and profound ways that are still with us. The legacy of slavery is embedded in our history, our culture, and in our laws and our court decisions. That's my thesis tonight. Let's move forward into it. So we start with the slavery era of 1619 and 1685. And of course, slaves existed before 1619. In fact, slaves have existed probably for as long as there were humans. But I'm choosing to start at 1619, as that is the anniversary that slaves were kidnapped in Africa and transported to the Americas. And you know, we're celebrating, strong word. It is the 400th anniversary of slaves in this country. Last year it was. And a question, you know, that sometimes people ask when the issue of slavery comes up is, why can't they just get over it? All that slavery stuff happened so long ago. And again, my thesis tonight is can't get over it because the legacy isn't over yet. And so let's see if we can connect the dots tonight for you. So we'll jump from 1619 to 1776. We all know 1776 is when the Declaration of Independence was drafted and adopted. And of course, you see the famous painting here. Thomas Jefferson, of course, authored the Declaration of Independence, and it was edited by Ben Franklin and John Adams. We all remember sort of the really famous lines from the Declaration of Independence, and here is a picture of a copy of the Declaration of Independence, of Jefferson's original draft of the Declaration of Independence. You can see, you know, the edits that were made here. But let's focus on the well-known language. So here it is. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. You can kind of see on the second line here where the edit has been made, that all men are created equal, and what was scratched out is and independent. So originally it read all men are created equal and independent. And so, you know, these soaring words, profound, inspirational, but I'm mindful that the ink jar that moistened the quill pen to write all men are created equal was probably filled that morning by human slaves. And so, you know, one of my goals here tonight is not to denigrate the founders or anything they did. In fact, just the opposite. In my opinion, fully understanding the folks who founded our country makes it more inspirational. For me, makes them human. And so that's why I look to the. I want to see the fuller picture. I want to see the fuller picture. What's interesting, though, what's especially interesting about the Declaration of Independence is that Thomas Jefferson, again, the primary author of the Declaration, actually wrote a 168-word passage condemning slavery. And he blamed Britain's King George for forcing slavery on the Americas. And in so many words, Jefferson called it a crime against humanity. For some reason, that passage condemning slavery was cut from the final wording. And so I wonder why. You know, this declaration gave such powerful voice to the values behind the American Revolution, but many of the founders owned slaves. You know, 1/3 of the Declaration signers were slave owners. And the population at the time of the original 13 colonies, 1/5 of the population were slaves. And so 1/5 of the population were deprived of their inalienable right to liberty. You know, even at the time, 1776, of the Declaration of Independence and sort of the official founding of our break from England, the colonies were already deeply divided on the issue of slavery. Both the North and the South had financial stakes in the perpetuation of slavery. Certainly the South, we understand, with their plantations, slaves were a real key engine in their economy. They needed the free labor to produce the tobacco and the sugar and the cotton and other cash crops that then got exported to Europe. And the northern colonies also played a major role in the perpetuation of the slave economy, because the North is where the shipping merchants primarily were, and thus created this dependency on that triangle between Africa, the Americas, and Europe, which made shipping really profitable to bring slaves from Africa to the Americas, pick up crops from the Americas, and sail them to Europe. And of course, here's, I'm sure we've all seen this picture of the final version of the Declaration of Independence. And with all respect to our founders, you know, they failed to directly address the issue of slavery. And so this is, you know, our nation's founding document, our moral mission statement. It's silent on the issue of slavery. That omission from the Declaration, you know, sort of starts our country off with an exclusion for people of African descent, and engendered centuries of struggle over basic human civil rights. All men are created equal, but they weren't. But notwithstanding slavery, this document reveals the underlining ideals of freedom, equality, and have inspired generations of Americans to struggle to obtain their inalienable rights. So here is George Washington. We know him, one of the founders of our country, the famous painting by John Trumbull, 1780. And of course, you notice who else is in the painting. That's William Lee, who was Washington's personal servant slave. You know, something interesting about George Washington is that when he became president in 1789, he only had one natural tooth left in his mouth. And of course, we can understand that. 18th century dentistry, as bad as it was, 18th century medicine. But contrary to popular lore, George Washington's dentures, which were made for him, were not made of wood. They were made of real teeth that came from slaves. And so, you know, it takes a bit to wrap your head around that, he had a mouthful of teeth that were from slaves. Now, there is one notation in Washington's papers that for some of the teeth, he paid some money to a slave for some of the teeth. So we don't know to what extent it was involuntary to procure the teeth. And so one of my points, and I'll reiterate this over and over, is that slavery was embedded. It had been embedded in human affairs for millennia. And so it is no surprise that it is embedded at the time that our country is founded. And the embedding of slavery and the culture of slavery in our country has effects. It had effects then, and it has effects now. And I know, the title of my talk is supposed to talk about slavery starting in 1787. Here we are before 1787. And I'll get there. I just want to impress upon you the ingrained nature of slavery. So here's something else from prior to 1787. This is Pennsylvania's Gradual Abolition Action of 1780. Again, we had this divide with the anti-abortion sentiment certainly much greater in the North than it was in the South. But there were slaves in the North. But anyway, Pennsylvania legislature passed this Gradual Abolition Act. And what it says is that if a slave is in Pennsylvania for 6 months, then the slave can petition for their freedom. Now, the seat of government for us was Pennsylvania. And so legislators who owned slaves would come to Pennsylvania. And so you had Jefferson, Washington coming to Philadelphia. And so what they did is they had this elaborate sort of shuffling plan where they would make sure that no slave was in Pennsylvania for more than 6 months. And in that way, none of their slaves would be able to petition for their freedom while in Pennsylvania. So again, the embedded nature that even in the North where there was anti-slavery sentiment, that even there the embedded nature of slaves allowed slave owners to do this shuffling act and maintain their slave servants. And here is Martha Dandridge Custis Washington. This is George Washington's wife. I'm bringing her up again. I want to show the embedded nature of slavery. George Washington's wife was a widow. She was married before marrying George Washington. Her first husband died, and when he died, she inherited a life estate of more than 100 slaves. Now, what does that mean? These were called dower slaves as part of her dowry. And so she was able to, this is going to sound strange to our ears, but because slaves were considered property, the 100 slaves that she inherited, she was allowed to possess them, to use them, but she couldn't sell them. So she had possession and use of these 100 or so slaves for the balance of her life. And upon her death, these slaves then became the property of her children from her first marriage. And so even though George Washington did free his slaves upon his death, Martha Washington wasn't allowed to free her slaves. And of course, upon her death, they were then inherited by the children from her first marriage. So, we want to own up to the humanity of people like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. Yeah, that they owned slaves. They owned people. And sometimes these people were separated from their loved ones. They were made to work without pay, to live without dignity, to suffer whippings, sometimes made to disappear. So here we have Thomas Jefferson, our third president. He owned 300 plus slaves. One was a slave named Sally Hemings. Um, she was his uh, chamber slave, if you were. So she took care of his bedroom, emptying the chamber pot, things like that. Jefferson began an affair with his concubine, Sally Hemings. And in fact, she traveled with him to Paris in 1787. Thomas Jefferson went to Paris to represent our new country to France, and she went with him. She was 14 years old. And so 2.5 years later, when it was time to return to the US, France was a different place than our country. And in France, Sally Hemings could petition for her freedom. But at the time that they were ready to come back to the US, she was pregnant with her first child from Thomas Jefferson. And so he wanted her, of course, to come back with him to the US, and she stood up for herself and had some conditions. And the conditions were that she be given special privileges, one, and two, that her children would be freed from slavery at the age of 21. Jefferson agreed to this, so Sally Hemings returned to our country with Jefferson, and she bore him 6 children. 4 survived to maturity, and of course, those 4 children had children on down the line till you see this picture of Shannon Lanier, who is 6th great grandson of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings. And of course, that has been shown, proven through DNA testing. Again, Thomas Jefferson, the brilliant writer and author of so much of what our country stands for, owned slaves and did what arguably was probably unthinkable for its time, even for its time, is to have sex with his slave and have children by them. And so slavery was embedded, and it was just an accepted fact of life. So, from the Declaration of Independence in 1776 to 1787, our country was ruled by our government, and it was a confederation, and was run by the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation weren't working. The Articles of Confederation, which was our first constitution, did not have a strong central government. The states were more powerful than the central government, and as a result, the country was a mess. Each state had its own ability to create its own money if they wanted to, their own measurements, and so trading and dealing with among the different states was difficult. And so a group got together, many of our founders, and they went to Philadelphia to the Second Constitutional Convention with the original intention of amending the Articles of Confederation. And as they started amending the Articles, they realized, gee, the Articles of Confederation aren't working. We need to just redo the whole Constitution. And so that's what they started doing. I think like you, I sort of reveled in the stories growing up about our founders, and the patriotic stories of George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and others. And I think I share with you my inclination to just think how noble our founders were, and how what they created is reflected in us today. Um, and though making them more human, the acts of our founders included slavery, and these things are also reflected in who we are today. In May of 1787, the 55 delegates from 12 states arrived in Philadelphia for the Second Constitutional Convention. We had 13 colonies, but Rhode Island chose not to send any delegates. These folks were white, they were educated, they were affluent property owners, a majority were lawyers, and they averaged 42 years old. So what the heck did they talk about? What were the issues at the Second Constitutional Convention? And so there are primary issues and then underlying issues. So here are the primary issues: power and money, power and money. And what the deal was, what controversies were, was one, how many members each state would have in the House of Representatives. So as they went forward with the Second Constitutional Convention and realizing they needed to create a whole new constitution, and they decided to go with a federal form of government. A federal form of government, of course, involves a strong central government sharing power with states who are, relatively speaking, weaker than the central government. And so, creating a three-branch system of government, a legislative branch, an executive branch, and a judicial branch, and splitting the power up so no one branch could have too much power. So in the legislative branch, you had the House of Representatives, which is made up of people who are elected based on their representation of numbers. And so numbers decided how many members of the House of Representatives each state would have. So that was like the first big issue, is how many members each state would have. Second issue, how many electoral votes each state would have in presidential elections. The third issue, how much each state would pay in direct taxes to the federal government. This first one is particularly important. So let me go on here. Here's the preamble. Again, soaring language from one of our founders. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. The preamble was written by the gentleman you see there, Governor Morris. He was not the governor of a state. Governor here is actually his first name. Governor Morris was, by all descriptions, was a charming and witty man. He had a peg leg. And so I tried to find out why he had a peg leg, what caused him to lose his leg so that he had to have a peg leg, but I wasn't able to find that. But what we do know about him, and it was known at the time, but it's confirmed by Governor Morris's own writings, that he had numerous affairs with married women. And again, his writing of this beautiful, inspirational language in our Constitution has to be contrasted with his humanity, the flaws that he had, that all of us have, and his flaws were having affairs with married women, women not married to him. So in our Constitution, the Constitution is divided into sections called articles. And so Article 1 of the Constitution creates the legislative branch, also known as Congress, and it gives, that section gives Congress its power. Article 2 of the Constitution created the executive branch, also known as the presidency. Article 3 created the judicial branch, which we know of as the courts. And so in Section 2 of Article 1, right, Section 2, Article 1, and it's important, Article 1. So this is in relation to Congress and the creation of Congress and the power given to Congress. So in this subsection 3 of Section 2, Article 1, regarding Congress, it says, representatives and taxes shall be apportioned among the several states, which may be included within this union, according to their respective numbers, which shall be determined by adding to the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years and excluding Indians not taxed, 3/5 of all other persons. You know, only the southern states had large numbers of slaves. Counting them in the population would really increase the South's political power. But it would also mean paying higher taxes. So the Southern legislators considered and decided, look, it's okay, we'll pay the higher taxes, but we want all the slaves to be counted as persons. Well, the northern states disagreed. And so, again, there was this divide that started in 1776, and here we are at 1787, and still we have this divide because of slavery. And so a compromise was reached, and each slave would count as 3/5 of a person. And I know to our ears that just sounds so weird. What do you mean 3/5 of a person? But again, the culture of slavery was embedded. Slaves were considered chattel, like cattle and horses, and to be bought and sold and used in whatever way you want to be used. And so here in this creation of our new Constitution, there was an opportunity to deal with slavery, but it wasn't dealt with directly. It was dealt with a compromise, the 3/5 compromise. So the 3/5 compromise increased the South's representation in Congress and the Electoral College. In 12 of the first 16 presidential elections, a Southern slave owner won. 12 of the first 18 owned slaves. And so look, I have X's on next to the names and pictures of those who owned slaves. And you can see John Adams up at the top, and his son, John Quincy Adams, also on the top, did not own slaves. On the second row, Millard Fillmore and Franklin Pierce did not own slaves. And in the last row, James Buchanan and Abraham Lincoln did not own slaves. And so, you know, the South, I guess, from a numbers standpoint, really made out better, as evidenced by the results of the presidential election. Also in the Constitution, so here you see we're in Article 4 now, Article 4. Section 2, subsection 3, it says, no person held to service or labor in one state under the laws thereof, escaping into another, shall, in consequence of any law or regulation therein, be discharged from any such service or labor, but shall be delivered up on claim of the party to whom such service or labor may be due. Now, you know, that language may feel a bit arcane, but basically what this required is that slaves who escaped would be returned to their owners. You know, the issue of slavery was so explosive between the northern and the southern states. The word slavery doesn't even appear in the Constitution. And that's why I've bolded and underlined and put in red the stand-in words for slavery. Persons held to service or labor. That was used because the word slavery was just repugnant. And you know, the northern states feared antagonizing the South because slavery was so embedded. As our founders, and this is my thesis, as they weighed the relative advantages and disadvantages of allowing slavery or to hold their ground and disallow slavery, well, they went with allow it because they wanted our country to be founded. They wanted it to be strong. They didn't want it to break up right away. And so they balanced in favor of allowing slavery. So here we are, Monday, September 17th, 1787, the day that the Constitution was adopted. And you can see the artist's rendering there of the members of the Constitutional Convention going up and signing the document. And I wanted to particularly show you a quote here. This is from James Madison, who was one of the founders, fourth president. He wrote on in fact, before that, let me tell you about James Madison. He was a real note taker. Probably did really well in school. A good note taker. And so much of what we know that went on in the Constitutional Convention is from him because he took such voracious notes. And so in writing about the day that the Constitution was adopted, he wrote, "It is possible to deliberate between anarchy and convulsion on one side and the chance of good to be expected from the plan on the other." So this is a statement directly about the issue of slavery. And, you know, he saw it as, look, we can either have anarchy and convulsion if we fight on the issue of slavery, or we can have a chance of good from the plan. The plan is the new Constitution. A chance of good to be expected from the other. And so in order to get unanimous consent on the adoption of the new Constitution, the signers opted for the chance of good. And to show you, you know, how worried and tense the situation was after the signing, the adoption vote and the signing of the new Constitution, the members went over to a local pub in town to drink, some to celebrate, some to commiserate. And Madison wrote about that event that George Washington was there, and he was worried. George Washington was worried so much about this new Constitution that he noted that he didn't think that the new central federal government would last even 20 years. So that shows you the stepping off the cliff kind of feeling that our founders had on adopting this new Constitution. You know, the northern delegates saw slavery as a dying institution. Their gamble, for lack of a better word, on the chance of good was kind of based on the hope, the expectation that slavery would just peter out and die its own death. And so they thought, well, we have a new Constitution and a new government. Yeah, we have slavery, but we had a new Constitution and a new government. But In 1794, now here it is 5 years after the ratification of our Constitution, because it took a couple of years to ratify it. So even though it was adopted in 1787, it wasn't ratified till 1789. And 5 years after that, the cotton gin is invented. And this made growing cotton on plantations immensely profitable, and thus slavery did not just peter out, did not just die out. In fact, it came back even stronger. So I want to show you these two buildings. On the left, you see the Charleston City Market in South Carolina. On the right, you see Gallia Hall in New Orleans, Louisiana. And if you notice the steps, and it's hard to see the steps in Gallia Hall, but you can see the steps clearly in the Charleston City Market. The reason the steps are that way is so because these are locations where slave auctions were held, and by putting the slaves up on the steps, the sellers of the slaves could show their wares in better ways, and thus make them potentially more marketable to potential buyers. And of course, today the Charleston City Market is not a slave market; it is a city market full of boutique shops and restaurants and things like that, and it's a real tourist attraction. And Gallia Hall was the city hall of New Orleans for many years until the new city hall was built. And today, Gallia Hall is used as a rental. People can rent the Gallia Hall for weddings and receptions and things like that. In fact, Abraham Lincoln visited New Orleans in 1830, and in fact saw his first and only slave auction there in New Orleans in 1830. All right, so let's move from the slave era to the Civil War era. Civil War era, 1861, 1865. So here we are 70 years after our Constitution came into effect. And, you know, in accordance with the 1860 census, the population of the then 34 states and 8 territories was 31.5 million people. You can see how the slavery split the U.S. The blue states were the Union states. The red states were the Confederate states, and the striped states were the border states. So there were no slaves. There were no slaves in 19 states. The border states, interestingly, had slavery, but they did not secede from the Union. And so they're kind of like not knowing, I guess, what to do. And there they are in between the two forces. So these border states, Delaware, Kentucky, Maryland, Missouri, and West Virginia. And so the census of 1860, there's 31.5 million people in the US. Abraham Lincoln is elected president, takes office in 1861. And you know, he personally hated slavery. He considered it immoral. But in his first inaugural address, he stated, and you see the quote there, "No purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with slavery in the states where it exists." So he made that commitment in his first inaugural address. Part of the problem was that already 7 states had seceded and Civil War had started. A year later, as the Civil War was raging, Lincoln wrote, "If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. If I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that." So we can see that even Lincoln, although he personally hated slavery, considered it immoral, understood the fractious nature of the issue of slavery, the embedded nature of slavery, and 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 his goal initially was not to end it, but he was thrown into history because the Southern states seceded, and so we can see that slavery played a central role in the American Civil War, and the issues of the day included the Western territories of whether slavery would be extended into those as well. And so the Civil War went on with hundreds of thousands of deaths and casualties to 1865. And so here in 1863, we have the Emancipation Proclamation issued by Abraham Lincoln. What's interesting about the Emancipation Proclamation is it only freed the slaves in the Confederate States. It did not free slaves who existed in the northern states, and there were slaves still in the northern states, but those states hadn't seceded, and so the Emancipation Proclamation only dealt with most, but some of the slaves were not dealt with in the Emancipation Proclamation. However, after the Civil War in 1865, Congress passed the 13th Amendment. It says, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. So the 13th Amendment did what the Emancipation Proclamation didn't do, and that is to free all of the slaves by saying slavery is not allowed. So the combination of the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment officially ended, or technically ended, slavery in the US. Then came the 15th Amendment, which reads, the right of the citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So this dealt, of course, with their right to vote. And of course, mixed in all of this, as the war ended in 1865, President Lincoln is assassinated, and we entered there was overlap between the end of the war, Lincoln's plans for the future, and his assassination. And at the time, there were competing visions for what should happen with the southern states and the unification or the reunification of the southern states with the northern states. And we call this the Reconstruction era. So the US really struggled with the challenges of how to reintegrate into the Union those states that had seceded, and what should be the legal status of the former slaves. So two visions sort of emerged. There was the emancipationist vision and there was the white supremacist vision. The emancipationist vision sought, and this was the one promoted by Abraham Lincoln, full freedom and citizenship and male suffrage and constitutional equality for all African Americans. The white supremacist vision included segregation and the preservation of the white political and cultural domination of the South. And so these two visions competed with each other. And after, however, Lincoln was assassinated, we got Andrew Johnson as president following Abraham Lincoln. He was a Democrat from Tennessee, and is a former slave owner himself. And there were various things that came into play, but Andrew Johnson wanted things to happen quickly. And so he favored rapid measures to bring the South back into the Union. And one of those rapid measures was to allow the Southern states to themselves to determine the rights of the former slaves. You know, again, this emancipationist vision of Reconstruction and the white supremacist vision of Reconstruction, it gave rise to the Ku Klux Klan, a group of people who believed in and fostered and embraced the white supremacist vision of Reconstruction. And you know, after the Civil War, public support for the Reconstruction efforts of the South that required continuous supervision of the South, the public sentiment for Reconstruction just faded. It faded in the North. And what remained was that Reconstruction under the emancipationist vision of Abraham Lincoln failed. The white supremacist vision of Reconstruction took hold. And of course, for African Americans, it was a complete disaster. So after Reconstruction comes the Jim Crow era, 1877 to 1954. So in the Jim Crow era, laws were created on the state and local levels that enforced racial segregation, primarily in the southern United States. These laws were enacted by legislatures to disenfranchise African Americans, remove their political and economic gains, and of course we saw the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, and of course the Ku Klux Klan rose in popularity to such an extent. You see here in 1926 they had a massive parade down Pennsylvania Avenue. You see the Congressional Dome in the background. So the Jim Crow era. But the world was changing. And in 1896, you have Mr. Homer Plessy. Mr. Plessy was 1/8 African American, and he decided he would challenge the Jim Crow laws, which set up the, quote, separate but equal facilities for whites and blacks. And the events that led to his case actually occurred in New Orleans. So he got in a train car that was intended only for whites. And of course, he had announced that he was 1/8 African American, and he refused to get off the train car that was for whites only, refused to give up his seat. He was arrested. His case went to the US Supreme Court, and Mr. Plessy lost. And the Supreme Court in Plessy versus Ferguson essentially approved segregation under the concept of separate but equal, that they approved that states and local governments could, as long as facilities and treatments were separate but equal, that was okay. And of course, as a body of law, all these Jim Crow laws supported here by the Supreme Court, it basically institutionalized discrimination on an economic basis, an educational basis, social basis, all disadvantages for African Americans. So we move to 1954 and we enter the Civil Rights era. So, this is sort of the era where I come in. I was born in 1954. And there was a landmark decision in 1954. The Brown versus Board of Education was a 9-0 decision, unanimous decision of the US Supreme Court, which held that separate but equal was not the law of the land anymore. And we see at the bottom paragraph the quote from Chief Justice Earl Warren: "In the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. You see in the picture is Linda Brown. Her father, Mr. Brown, attempted to enroll her in an all-white school, and they refused, and that started the lawsuit, which ultimately led in 1954 to Brown versus Board of Education. And of course, 1 year later, here we have Rosa Parks, who refused to give up her seat on a bus in Montgomery, Alabama. And she was arrested, and you see her there being booked. You know, her arrest sort of inspired and motivated the Montgomery bus boycott, and would lead to other boycotts, sit-ins, demonstrations. Many of them were led by Martin Luther King Jr. And of course, this movement would eventually lead to a toppling of, at least on a formal technical basis, the toppling of the Jim Crow laws of the South. So we move down to 1964, Civil Rights Act of 1964. You see in the picture there, President Johnson signing the Civil Rights Act, and President Johnson would use a separate pen for each letter of his name, and then give the pens as souvenirs to those around him. You see Dr. Martin Luther King there directly behind President Johnson. Now, the Civil Rights Act has a couple of stories that are just amazing to them. And again, we have to remember, we're talking about the legacy of slavery. And so slavery was wrestled at the beginning of our country. Slavery was wrestled when we created our current Constitution. Slavery was wrestled and sparked the whole Civil War with hundreds of thousands of dead. Slavery sparked, impacted Reconstruction, and Reconstruction failed, and thus slavery led to the Jim Crow laws. And now we're into the 1960s, and the attempt by African Americans to secure their inalienable rights promised to them, including from the 15th Amendment, which guaranteed them the right to vote, but they weren't getting the right to vote. So President Kennedy, who was president before Johnson and who was assassinated, and that's why Johnson became president, President Kennedy and his brother, Robert Kennedy, were sort of the movers, if you will, toward the Civil Rights Act the Civil Rights Act. But then after President Kennedy was assassinated, the mood of the country was such to, let's complete the work of our fallen president. And thus the Civil Rights Act had an opportunity to pass. However, the vote was really close. The Southern legislators did not want the Civil Rights Act to pass. Because why? Let's look at what it did. No segregation in public places. They did not want that. No discrimination in employment based on race, gender, or national origin. They did not want that. They opposed the Civil Rights Act. And so there were a couple of things that happened. The original Civil Rights Act did not include gender. And it just said there'd be no discrimination in employment based on race and national origin and color. And so gender was not in there. So the Southern legislators got the idea of, hey, let's put gender in the mix, and nobody wants equal rights there. And so if we put gender in, the Equal Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act will fail. Well, they put gender in there and it didn't fail. And so interestingly, because of that little quirk, gender became one of the protected classes in the Civil Rights Act. The other interesting thing about the Civil Rights Act is that, again, the vote was really close. And when it got to the Senate, to vote in the Senate, and the way it worked is they would call out the senator's name, and the senator would then say aye if the senator was voting in favor of the motion. Well, there was one senator from California who was dying of cancer, and he was unable to speak. So I assume it was some kind of throat cancer. And they actually had to carry him in on a pallet. And when they called his name, they carried him down to the center of the Senate, where the senators go down to vote. And he came to the location, and he pointed at his eye, meaning aye, he votes in favor of the act. And so adding gender, having senators who were dying come in and vote, the Civil Rights Act passed and became the law of the land. Now, 1 year after that came the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and you can see the quote by President Johnson: "It is wrong, deadly wrong, to deny any of your fellow Americans the right to vote in this country." Because you know what was happening? What was happening is that, particularly in the South, African Americans would go to attempt to register to vote, and they had been told the wrong date or the wrong location, or that they didn't possess sufficient literary skills, not literary, literacy skills, or that they filled out their registration application incorrectly. Sometimes they were forced to recite pieces of the Constitution, or explain really complex portions of state laws. Many of these tasks white voters would have been hard pressed to do. And so it was that kind of those kind of things were happening, which led to the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And then we get to 1968. 1968 was a real insane year. You see in the top left, immediately after Martin Luther King was shot and killed, you see his aides pointing to where they think the shot came from. On the top right, Robert Kennedy is assassinated. He was the leading presidential candidate, the leading Democratic presidential candidate in 1968, which is an election year, and he is assassinated. In the bottom left, you see, and it's hard to see if you adjust your eyes to it, you see it's a shallow grave with some bodies in it. Well, these were 3 Freedom Riders. The Freedom Riders were groups of people, many of whom were college students, who came down to the South to help African Americans register to vote. 3 of these Freedom Riders disappeared and were later found, as you can see, murdered and buried in a shallow grave. So a kind of scary and dangerous year. And you see in the bottom right, there's the Hancock County Courthouse again. And so I need to tell you my story of my arrest. So in that year, I was a counselor at a summer camp. This summer camp was for the underprivileged children of New Orleans. And of course, by underprivileged children, we're talking mostly African American. So anyway, these underprivileged children of New Orleans were brought over to this camp in Bay St. Louis, Mississippi. It was right on the waterfront, and so the children had swimming lessons and activities, and archery, and canoeing, and places for them to play and run. Just a real free and joyful time for those children. And so I'm a counselor at this summer camp, and at night, half the counselors are on duty with the children in the cabins where they slept, and the other half of the counselors were off duty. And so this particular night, those of us that were off duty decided to get in a car and ride down to the local Frost Stop to get some burgers and fries. Frost Stop is like a Burger King, right? Frost Top. And so we got in the car, we drove down to the Frost Stop. We were followed by a policeman. So, we went the speed limit and all that. we got to the frost stop, and we knew that the black counselors that were with us could not go into the frost stop because they would not be served, and it would cause an incident. So the white counselors, we went in, we bought the burgers and fries and sodas for everyone, got back in the car and drove back to the camp. Instead of pulling into the camp, we decided just pull up in front of the camp so that we could walk out and eat our food by looking out at the Bay St. Louis. And so as soon as we stopped the car and got out, the policeman who followed us got out of his car and said we were all under arrest. So he got on his radio and other cars came. They separated us and brought us down to the Hancock County Courthouse, or at least the jail behind the courthouse. We found out later, we didn't know this at the time, we found out later that the charge was that in Bay St. Louis, it was against the law for a black person and a white person to ride in a private car together. And of course, that's exactly what we did. We got in the car to drive down to the local frost stop. So that's what we were charged with. Each of us were questioned separately. And I'll have to say it was very scary. I remember the sheriff, deputy, whoever he was, questioning me, saying something, son, we've been watching you having an orgy with those no good, and of course, all the expletives for African Americans. And of course, I'm crying. I don't know what's happening. And all I could say is, honest officer, we were not having an orgy. I've never seen a naked lady in my life. So just crying my eyes out. Eventually, they allowed the oldest of our group to make a call, and he called the camp and woke up the camp director. The camp director called New Orleans, because, New Orleans is just an hour away from Bay St. Louis. They sent a lawyer in the middle of the night. They sent a lawyer. And so the lawyer, I think he gets there, I don't know, 3:30, 4:30 in the morning. And I could hear him, having an argument with the sheriff, saying, you arrested these kids for what, sheriff? You're kidding me. Now, sheriff, your picture is going to be on the cover of Life magazine next week with this kind of action that you've taken against these kids. These are kids. What are you doing? Eventually, the sheriff agreed to drop the charges and let us go. But it was still a scary time, because to get to our car, we had to walk through a row of deputies, all of whom had their guns drawn. And so we walked, and it sounds pretty lame today. But as we walked to the car, we sang "We Shall Overcome." And I think about that today and how easily we could have disappeared, just like the three Freedom Riders. And so it was a terrible year, but it did, at least for me, inspire a life of interest in the law, a career in the law. And so it was a milestone event, certainly in my life. Then we moved to the affirmative action era, 1978 to 2016. Affirmative action involves a set of laws and policies and guidelines and administrative agency rules intended to end and correct the effects of specific forms of discrimination. And so the way to end and correct discrimination is by government-mandated, government-approved programs that gave advantages to minorities and women. The programs tended to focus on education and employment, and gave special considerations, again, to minorities and women who were historically excluded groups, historically discriminated against. And so again, the goal here was to address the disadvantages associated with the past discrimination, and as a way to maybe ensure that public institutions like universities and schools and hospitals and police forces were more representative of the populations they served. So affirmative action. Now, of course, affirmative action has met with significant opposition by saying that, look, by giving advantages to some minorities and women in certain situations, you're having to discriminate against white people, or white men, and so you're using a wrong to try and correct a wrong. And so those who opposed affirmative action said, you know, that those wrongs cannot make right what happened in the past. And so there have been various cases involving affirmative action. And the most recent case is the 2016 case of Fisher versus the University of Texas. And in that case, the US Supreme Court, as you see, upheld the limited use of affirmative action in university admissions in order to promote cross-racial understanding, move to destroy racial stereotypes, prepare students for an increasingly diverse workforce and society, and the cultivation of leaders with legitimacy in the eyes of the citizenry. There is another case that is winding its way through the courts. It's currently at the Court of Appeals level, involving Asian Americans who have felt the effects of discrimination because they are disproportionately represented in education, in elite colleges, that kind of thing. And so their universities have purposefully not accepted as many Asian Americans in favor of the other races. And so Asian Americans are claiming that this is inappropriate discrimination. And so this case will probably at some point reach the US Supreme Court. So then we get to the Black Lives Matter era. You know, this era is sort of created this loose group of groups of like-minded people who advocate against police violence toward Black people, trying to intervene in the politics and ideologies of what African Americans have to endure through systematic and intentional targeted discrimination. And so we have a series of incidents. So, and I realize I've dated this from 2013, but in 2012, George Zimmerman was acquitted in the shooting death of African-American Trayvon Martin. And then in 2014, we have the death of Michael Brown at the hands of police. In 2014, the death of Eric Garner at the hands of police. 2019, the death of Tamir Rice at the hands of police. 2020, Breonna Taylor, death at the hands of the police. And of course, probably the best known, the death of George Floyd in 2020 at the hands of the police. And of course, there's a picture of Mr. Floyd shortly before his death. And of course, there are long-term cultural conditions that have inspired the Black Lives Matter era. And you see them: economic inequality, crime, drug addiction, family breakdown, unemployment, poor school performance. For me, again, my thesis is that the long history in our country, first of approving slavery, then outlawing slavery, but giving a wink and a nod, which basically permitted the continuing discrimination against blacks, and the slow, torturous attempt to redress those errors through to today. And of course, my thesis is that those effects of slavery continue through today. The legacy of slavery is here with us today. Part of this legacy of slavery is why Black people are, and you can see the various things. And you know, as I put this together and was looking at it this morning, I realized I left one out, and that is the mass incarceration of disproportionate numbers of African Americans versus other races. And so, again, to me, the legacy of slavery is found in all of these. So, you know, a little sociology concept here. Societies are not amalgams of unrelated individuals creating themselves anew in each generation. That's not what societies are. Down at the bottom, you see societies are a complex web of social connections and a long train of historical influences that interact. And on that basis, I think that slavery is still with us. When we look at the underclass culture in our society today, I think we are seeing a product of the oppressive history of slavery. The experience of the slaves and their descendants over time has been shaped by political, social, and economic institutions that are still with us today. Look at that, isn't it beautiful? The natural southern beauty, Spanish moss, charm, sophistication, large, beautiful houses, windows open for the breeze, bottomless bowls of freshly trawled shrimp, stone ground grits, grand homes, sprawling yards. Their pre-Civil War glory preserved right down to the wallpaper, the furniture, chandeliers. One envisions perhaps lovely carriage rides, slow evenings on the veranda, elegant dinners, sipping mint juleps. Perhaps, if you weren't a slave or a descendant of a slave, you know, it's often impossible to disentangle the beauty of the surroundings from the history of the surroundings. But that history is a painful one for those who are Black, who are the descendants of enslaved men and women. Charleston, New Orleans, Bay St. Louis, the rest of the South, it grew and it thrived because of the unpaid labor of African American men and women who had been kidnapped, beaten, enslaved, where they have been made to empty the chamber pots of their masters, have sex without consent with their masters, where they could be separated and often were separated from their children and sold. The descendants are still with us. The noxious cloud that is slavery still drifts over the places and the people, over all of us. So a question you hear sometimes is, I started with this question, is why can't they just get over it? All that slavery stuff happened so long ago. Because I don't think the effects of slavery are over. One of the things you often hear is, you know, around the issue of the statues in the South that have been so controversial whether they should be removed or not. On the one side, you have people who say, look, these statues reflect our heritage. And on the other side, you have people that say, no, they reflect the horrible crime that was slavery and should be removed. And so in answer to that question, why can't they just get over it? I think I go back to my thesis, because I don't think the effects of slavery are over. So, again, we're back here, Charleston and Gallia Hall. I want to tell you a little story about Gallia Hall. My college roommate and good friend got married, and his wedding reception was held in Gallia Hall. And after the reception was over, my job as best man was to drive them to the airport so they could go on their honeymoon. And so I remember as the reception was winding down, my buddy said, okay, they're ready to go and get the car. So I got the car and I pulled it around to the front of Gallia Hall. And as I waited for them I got out of the car and I was waiting for them. Here I am on the steps of Gallia Hall, and I'm thinking, holy cow, the irony of this, that people, slaves were here, slaves were sold, and here I am, and we're doing this wedding celebration, and just that the juxtaposition of those two things kind of hitting me at the same time, it was kind of overwhelming. And I remember when they came out to get in the car, they were like, something wrong? And I was like, no, let's go. And so, I kind of shook it off, but it was really kind of a profound moment, So yeah, why can't they just get over it? Well, I don't think we should get over it. We should learn it and understand it so that we could continue to strive to form a more perfect union. Martin Luther King, who struggled so mightily throughout his life, was hopeful. And I take hope from his words. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. Profound words from somebody who has been jailed and beaten and ultimately assassinated. So we're back to our Constitution. And I've underlined the words. So we have, we the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union. So I think to the students, my message is, we're in an election year, and I'm nearing the end of my career. And so this election potentially, probably, in my opinion, will have more impact on your lives than on my life. And so I think you have more skin in the game than I do. And so, our elections are our regular efforts to form a more perfect union. And so you have the power. You have some responsibility to be part of what happens next as the legacy of slavery kind of continues on. It morphs in different ways, but it's still with us. And the future of our nation is that I think by the year 2030, we will be a plurality of minorities. A plurality of minorities. That means there will not be any one race that has the most. We'll just be a group of minorities. And so we're going to have to learn to get along and to try and divest ourselves of the legacy of the past and to really strive to form a more perfect union. So that's it for tonight. Thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it. Please be safe going home. I'm gonna stop the recording now, and we can have some question and answers and chat afterwards. So again, thank you all for coming, and to the people watching, thank you for watching. Bye.